In the last video, we talked about Hu Gult, an 18-year-old who was executed only for China's Supreme People's Court to admit years later that it was a wrongful conviction. Today's case comes from the same atmosphere, under the same slogan, "Strike Hard." It was a nationwide anti-crime crackdown where speed was prioritized. Cases were expected to be closed quickly, an era when results were measured by how fast a case was processed, not by how accurate the evidence was. In 1994, a woman was found dead in a cornfield on the outskirts of Shijiazhuang. That's where Nie Shubin enters this story, an ordinary factory worker pulled into an investigation driven by the momentum of that crackdown era. In just 200 days, in April 1995, Nie Shubin was executed and the case was swiftly closed. But years later, another man, who had been arrested for other serious crimes, claimed that he was the one responsible for the death in that cornfield. From that moment on, the story stopped being simple. One case, but two confessions. And that leaves one unanswered question about everything that happened in between. If the truth was that clear, why did it take 21 years to reach it?
Hello, and welcome back to Dark Crimes Real.
On the afternoon of August 5, 1994, after finishing her shift, Miss Kang, 36, a female worker at a hydraulic parts factory in Shijiazhuang village, Hebei province, rode her bicycle home through a cornfield. But late that night, she still hadn't returned. Worried something had happened to her on the road, her family rushed to notify the police and the factory. The factory's management assisted the police and Miss Kang's family in organizing a search. By noon on August 11th, the search team found a woman's dress and underwear rolled into a bundle under a pile of grass beside a machine well in the cornfield. Miss Kang's husband identified them as his wife's belongings. Not far away, the body of Kang Mumu was found, next to her bicycle and her key ring. The location where the body was discovered was only a few dozen meters from Kang's dormitory. Police immediately sealed off the scene. After a brief investigation, they determined it was a case of rape and murder committed along the road. According to forensic findings, Miss Kang died at around 5 p.m. on August 5th, right after her shift that day. Her body showed signs of being beaten and sexually assaulted. Nie Shubin, born November 6, 1974, was a worker at one of the factories in that industrial area, about 15 kilometers from the scene. He was treated as a suspect because, according to the statements of several anonymous witnesses, he often rode a mountain bike to follow women. Nie was taken into custody and interrogated on October 1, 1994. During his detention, he did not confess until the 6th day. On October 9, 1994, Nie was formally arrested. The authorities at the time quietly proceeded with Nie's trial and prevented the defendant's family from attending court. Nie later told the lawyer that he was beaten and forced to confess on the 6th day of his detention. Throughout the handling of the case, police disclosed almost no information about the investigation or how the suspect was arrested, stating only that they suspected Nie because a witness pointed him out. On March 15, 1995, the Shijiazhuang Intermediate People's Court convicted Nie of intentional homicide and rape and sentenced him to death. According to the first instance judgment, at around 5 p.m., defendant Nie Shubin followed Miss Kang. When they reached a stretch of Shifen Road in Kongsai village on the outskirts of Shijiazhuang, Nie Shubin deliberately used his bicycle to knock Kang down, took her into a cornfield on the east side of the road, and used force to carry out his act. After that, he killed her using a floral patterned shirt he was carrying. That judgment was confirmed as being based on Nie Shubin's confession. He also led police to identify the crime scene and the location where the victim's clothing was buried, which matched the on-scene investigation findings. Nie Shubin identified a photograph of Kang taken before her death and the items collected from the crime scene, confirming they were the victim's photo and clothing. Nie Shubin's description of the victim's build and clothing matched the statements of the victim's husband, Hao Momo, and witness Yu Momo. Therefore, the first instance court concluded that defendant Nie Shubin intercepted and sexually assaulted a woman, then killed her to cover up the crime. After the first instance verdict, Nie Shubin appealed. On April 25, 1995, the court upheld the conviction and sentence for intentional homicide, revised the rape charges sentence to 15 years in prison, and ordered the sentences to be served concurrently, resulting in the death penalty and lifelong deprivation of political rights. Nie was then executed on April 27, 1995. He was only 20 years old. Nie's parents were not even notified of the execution and were not allowed to see their son one last time. On the 28th, Nie's father went to the detention center as usual to deliver daily necessities for his son, and staff told him, "Don't come anymore. Your son was executed yesterday." At the time, an official at the Hebei Procurator objected, arguing that aside from the confession, which may have been coerced, there was no other evidence of Nie's guilt, and requested that the verdict be changed. According to some rumors, Su Yong-ye, then the secretary of the Hebei Political and Legal Affairs Committee, was the one who ordered security officials to kill him, and kill him quickly. At that time, the case didn't draw much public attention, even though Nie's parents kept insisting on his innocence and continued to file appeals. After their son was executed, overwhelmed by grief, Nie's father, Mr. Shijiazhuang, tried to take his own life by swallowing sleeping pills, but he survived. From then on, the 72-year-old man was left partially paralyzed on one side of his body. Encouraged by his family and driven by the determination to clear Nie's name, Mr. Shijiazhuang pushed himself to keep going, training diligently and taking medication as he waited for the day his son would be declared innocent. For many years, Nie's parents never stopped appealing to restore their son's name. From a small village in Hebei province, they traveled to cities both large and small to seek justice for nearly 2 decades. Ms. Zhang, Nie's mother, stood by her position. She understood her son. She believed that Nie was innocent. Even so, throughout all those years, no one believed the family. People said it was normal for parents to refuse to believe what their child had done, but in the end, the faith Nie's parents held was proven right. 10 years after the case seemed permanently closed, everything was suddenly dragged back into the light when a man named Wang Shujin came forward and confessed that he himself had raped and killed Miss Kang. Around March 2005, police in Xinjiang City, Hainan Province, noticed a migrant worker named Wang, 38 years old, who worked at a local brick factory and behaved strangely. Wang kept to himself, spoke little, and almost avoided contact with the people around him. When he did talk, he usually kept his head down and rarely looked directly at the person in front of him. He also wouldn't share personal details, saying only that he was from Hebei province. Over 6 years working in Hainan, Wang had never once returned home. Whenever police conducted residency checks, he tried to avoid them, and he would often lower his head when he saw patrol vehicles pass by. Those signs made local police suspicious. Using the fact that Wang had no ID card and had not registered for temporary residence, Xinjiang police brought him to the station to provide information. There, Wang gave his full name as Wang Yongjun and said he was from Feishan County, Handan City, Hebei Province. but when Xinjiang police checked the National Household Registration System, they found no matching record. They then asked the Handan Public Security Bureau to assist, but the results still did not match the database. Wang's evasive and inconsistent statements only strengthened police suspicion that he was hiding something, because an ordinary person would have no reason to repeatedly lie about his identity. As a result, Xinjiang police decided to keep Wang at the station overnight and questioned him continuously. In the end, Wang admitted, "I've killed someone." He then said his real name was Wang Shujin, 38 years old, from Guangping County, Handan City. Wang also confessed that between 1993 and 1995, he had committed 6 major crimes in Hebei province, 4 cases of rape and murder, and 2 cases of rape. Xinjiang police immediately contacted Handan police to report the case and transferred him back to the local authorities. There, Wang continued by admitting he was responsible for a rape case from 1994. He said that in the summer of that year, he raped and killed a woman in the western outskirts of Shijiazhuang. Based on this statement, Handan police went to Shijiazhuang to review the matter. But when they searched for the case file, they found only one case from the same period with similar details, Miss Kong's case, where Nie had been convicted as the perpetrator and executed 10 years earlier. The case had already been closed. Only then did Wang learn that the Shijiazhuang case had been closed and that the perpetrator had already been put to death. Even so, Wang insisted that he was the true killer in Nie's case. In addition to Miss Kang's case, Wang confessed to 5 more cases, and those 5 all took place in Guangping County, bringing the total to 6, as he had originally stated. Wang provided a confession described as credible and matching many details, and he led police twice to the western outskirts of Shijiazhuang to identify the location of the crime scene. According to Wang, he worked at a construction site about 200 meters from where the crime occurred. He said he had noticed Miss Kang before because she often passed through the area, and that day he developed criminal intent. Wang said he slipped away from his coworkers, hid in the cornfield, waited for Miss Kang to pass, and then rushed out to attack her. He also said he threw Miss Kang's keyring into the cornfield. This was considered an especially important detail because 10 years earlier, during the crime scene examination, police had found Miss Kang's keyring in the cornfield and photographed it, but the information had never been made public. If he were not the perpetrator, Wang was believed to have no way of knowing that detail. After Wang's confession and the growing suspicion that Nie may have been wrongfully executed, Ma Yunlong, then a reporter for Henan Shangbao, published a short article about the case. Convinced by Wang's confession and believing Nie was innocent, Ma then sent his article, along with information he had gathered from the police, to more than 200 newspapers across China. The country was shaken by the story of Wang and Nie. Ma titled his explosive piece, "One Case, Two Killers. Who is the Real Killer?" The Guangping County Public Security Bureau in Handan City, the agency handling the case, became the center of nationwide attention, driving efforts to clarify Nie's case and delaying the execution of Wang's death sentence. Wang Shujin's confession also gave Nie's parents renewed strength and courage to keep fighting. Miss Zhang hired a lawyer and began legal proceedings to clear her son's name. Soon after filing an appeal, the Hebei Provincial Political and Legal Affairs Committee announced it would form a joint investigative team with other judicial agencies in the province to review the case. Even so, 10 years passed without any positive decision being made in Nie's case. Meanwhile, Hebei Provincial Police quickly set up a special task force, an effort that lasted about a year. By March 2006, Wang was indicted for intentional homicide and rape in connection with 5 cases, not including Miss Kang's case. During Wang's trial, Wang and his lawyer tried to show that Wang was also the perpetrator in Nie's case, while prosecutors argued that Wang did not commit that crime. On March 12, 2007, Wang was sentenced to death and later appealed because the court did not recognize him as the perpetrator in the Western Shijiazhuang cornfield case. However, Wang's appeal failed because the court maintained that Ms. Kang's case had already identified Nie as the culprit. In September 2013, Wang's subsequent appeal was rejected, and the original sentence was upheld, on the grounds that Wang's confession in that case did not match certain physical evidence. For example, Wang claimed he stepped on the victim's chest after the assault, but the forensic report did not record any fractures in the chest. Wang said the victim was wearing a shirt with a small floral pattern, while the physical evidence showed a different pattern. Even so, the victim's father insisted that police had come to their home and seized more than one of his daughter's shirts. He also said the shirt presented at Nie's trial was not the same as the one shown at Wang's trial. There were also views that Wang was trying to build credibility by confessing to Nie's case, because doing so could lead to a lighter sentence if he confessed to a crime he had committed that investigators had not known about before he admitted it. In addition, according to some rumors, Xu Yongye, then the Minister of State Security, was believed to have stepped in and made significant efforts to obstruct the investigation by relying on former colleagues in Hebei and other senior officials in the Ministry of State Security. The Hebei provincial authorities were also said to have tried to force Wang Shujin to revise his confession, even through threats of torture. It was not until December 2014 when the Supreme People's Court ordered a retrial of Nie's case at the Shandong High People's Court that his family finally saw a glimmer of hope in their long, exhausting fight for justice. In December 2014, at the request of the Hebei High People's Court, the Supreme People's Court instructed the Shandong High People's Court to conduct a review of the case. On that basis, a 5-judge panel was formed to examine the full record with the relevant parties, while also closely checking the victim's autopsy findings, including verifying whether the victim had any broken bones. The panel also made multiple investigative trips to Hebei and other related locations to look into the facts and to communicate with the defendant's side and their lawyers. After the review, the Shandong High People's Court concluded that the original judgment lacked sufficient objective evidence to definitively establish Nie Shubin's guilt. The court found that there were still significant doubts about the time of the crime, the instrument used, and the victim's cause of death, that the evidence relied on to convict and sentence Nie was both unreliable and incomplete, and that it was not possible to rule out the involvement of another perpetrator. For these reasons, the Shandong High People's Court recommended that the Supreme People's Court initiate retrial proceedings. The Supreme People's Court accepted that recommendation and decided to place the case into the retrial review process. After 4 requests for extensions of the review deadline, by May 2016, the Shandong High People's Court again determined that the rulings of the 2 Hebei courts lacked objective evidence and that there were serious doubts around the time of death, the alleged murder weapon, and the victim's cause of death. On that basis, the conclusion that Nie had been convicted of rape and murder was deemed unfounded. The decision stated that from the very starting point, placing Nie Shubin under suspicion involved serious problems. Before he was taken under control, investigators had no evidence or clues showing he was connected to the case. Nie was mainly targeted because he looked like the vague description of a young man reported by local residents. At around 6 p.m. on September 23, 1994, when Nie passed by on a blue mountain bike, investigators believed he matched that description and detained him, then imposed a measure of residential surveillance. However, the document emphasized that in this situation, residential surveillance essentially amounted to unlawful detention because it was not based on any specific grounds for accusation. From there, the document raised major doubts about how the confession had been produced. It could not be ruled out that investigators used coercive methods such as violence, forced interrogation, or inducement to compel Nie to confess. Moreover, the confession itself, witness statements, and even the autopsy report could not clearly determine when the crime occurred. The victim's time of death was assessed as unclear, making the time of the offense accepted by the earlier judgment vague and lacking a reliable foundation. The document also stated that the murder weapon in the old record was not clearly identified. It even raised the suspicion that the short-sleeved shirt shown in the color photographs of physical evidence may not have been present at the original crime scene at all, and may instead have been inserted to reinforce the weapon narrative in Nie's confession. The procedural steps related to the crime scene examination and forensic appraisal were also questioned. The crime scene examination record had no witnesses as required by law. The autopsy report was criticized as lacking scientific rigor, with both its authenticity and legal validity considered doubtful. As a result, the earlier conclusion that the victim died from asphyxiation was regarded as unreliable and unsupported by sufficient evidence. Another especially serious issue was the loss of documents and the gaps in the case file. The document noted that Nie's confession records from September 23 to September 27, 1994, along with his work attendance records, had gone missing, while the explanation offered by investigators was deemed unreasonable. This led to the suspicion that evidence favorable to Nie may have been concealed. Similarly, a witness surnamed Yu once stated that police quickly opened a case file right after the victim's body was discovered, yet many early statements from Yu and others in the original trial file were missing, and the whereabouts of those individuals were unknown. Those missing statements could have been important information and might even have benefited the defendant. In addition to missing documents, the existing file also showed irregular signs, such as signatures believed to be forged. For that reason, it could not be ruled out that the case file had been fabricated or altered. Notably, the document referenced a hidden detail unique to the case, the keyring the victim left at the scene. According to the document, Nie never confessed to this detail, and his failure to know or mention the keyring seriously undermined the credibility of his confession. Finally, the document introduced the element of new evidence from Wang Shujin's statements. After being tried in another location, Wang voluntarily admitted that he raped and killed someone in a cornfield on the western outskirts of Shijiazhuang. In particular, he knew about the keyring at the scene, information that investigators had not publicly disclosed. Wang's account of the time, location, sequence of events, and the place where clothing was buried was said to align with the facts of the case. For that reason, the document argued that Wang's confession should be treated as new evidence, and that the likelihood of Wang being the perpetrator was assessed as higher than that of Nie. On December 2, 2016, Nie was declared not guilty, 21 years after he had been wrongfully executed. A video clip of Nie's family breaking down in tears as they heard the decision was shared thousands of times on Weibo, China's social media platform. Throughout the court's announcement, Ms. Zhang remained composed, but when she heard the word "not guilty," she suddenly burst into sobs and began repeatedly slamming her hand on the table. She said she had long hoped for this day, but her son would not come back. Through tears, Ms. Zhang said she would visit her son's grave to comfort him when she returned home to Luquan District in Hebei Province. The family's lawyer, Li Shuting, kept patting Ms. Zhang on the back, while he himself cried behind his glasses. Nie Shubin, Nie Shubin's father, said this was the happiest day he had had in more than 20 years since his son was executed. On an unnamed hill near Shijiazhuang village in Hebei province, China, there is a solitary grave belonging to Nie Shubin. The grave sits apart in a desolate area because, under local custom, if someone dies before their parents, they are not allowed to be buried in the family's ancestral burial ground. One day after Nie was declared not guilty, his family went to the grave to burn incense for the young man. It was also the first time in more than 2 decades that Nie's father was able to visit his son. Many reporters and media outlets followed the family on that trip. In front of the grave, a nephew read the court's statement aloud, then burned a copy of the judgment into ashes as a way of sending it to the deceased in the world beyond. Nie's mother cried as she said their 21 years of struggle had not been in vain. At last, the Supreme People's Court had declared Nie innocent. Nie was a good man, and he would never have to carry this crime again. Now, Nie could finally rest. Ms. Zhang also promised her son that after she and her husband passed away, Nie's grave would be moved to the family burial ground so the family could be reunited. Nie's case was recorded in the history of China's justice system, and local media called it a classic wrongful conviction. My husband and I often told each other that we had to live long enough to see the day our son was cleared, Nie's mother, Zhang Huanji, told Xinhua in 2014. I truly regret that I couldn't see my son one last time. The only thing I can do is try to prove he was innocent, to ease the pain, the 72-year-old mother said. The Hebei High People's Court, the body that upheld Nie's murder conviction in 1995, paving the way for his execution, later posted a sincere apology to his parents on Weibo and overturned his criminal conviction. By 2017, Nie's parents received compensation from the Chinese government totaling 2.68 million yuan, about 390,000 USD. Nie Shubin's case is also believed to have influenced the Chinese government's move to require that all police interrogations be video recorded. And on February 2, 2021, Wang was executed for the murders that had once been attributed to Nie. On that hill near Shijiazhuang, Nie Shubin's grave still sits there like a quiet final punctuation mark on a story where justice arrived far too late. In 2016, the words "not guilty" were finally spoken, but they could not undo a gunshot in 1995, and they could not return a life cut off at 20. This case leaves behind a cold truth. When a system is pressured to close cases, a confession can become a verdict, and doubts get pushed aside. And then, more than 2 decades later, a chain of reviews, another confession, gaps in the file, and new evidentiary standards forced the court to admit what should have been clear from the start, that the evidence was not enough to convict. For Nie's family, it was a victory of persistence, but also an incomplete consolation. For society, it is a reminder of the cost of a wrongful conviction, not just an overturned judgment, but a human life, a family, and trust that was damaged. If anything can be taken from this story, it is the need for transparency in interrogation and trial. Before the law takes a human life, the truth must be proven to the point where there is no doubt left.